I'm Rob Prufer of the Loggia Lecture series at the Bellevue Arts Museum, hunkered down at home. Now, if you've ever been to a Loggia lecture at BAM, then you will recognize this slide. This is our emblem for the Loggia series, the facade of the Bellevue Arts Museum conjoined with the Loggia dei Lanzi in Florence, Italy. At each loggia, I prepare an art history talk, and all of us together in attendance discuss ideas from the talk during and after, a little bit like these people we see in this engraving underneath the BAM facade. We won't be doing that for this episode. This is instead a loggia in the living room, which is why I've inserted my couch into the loggia. Indeed, here I am in my living room. Here's my couch right over my shoulder. I've prepared for you a loggia, in fact, a logetta, a little loggia, a little bit more than 30 minutes. Before I start, some thanks. I could not have done this without Bellevue Arts Museum's Emily Smith, who for the last 3 or 4 weeks has been helping me so much with the technology. Same with my next door neighbor, Matt Sawyer, who generously spent much of an afternoon troubleshooting and, alas, fixing a tech problem that I was having. My deepest gratitude goes to my lovely wife, Leslie, who's not only a perceptive editor, but inspires me as a passionate traveler and student of architecture and art. Let's get started. This edition of the Logetta is entitled The Innocents at Home. Play a little bit on the Mark Twain book. It grows out of my thinking. Perhaps a lot of us have been thinking about healthcare workers in this moment. And in particular, I've thought about dozens and dozens of former students of mine who in various forms have gone into healthcare. Some have become nurses, epidemiologists, doctors, physical therapists, occupational therapists. And I've been thinking about all of them. And this topic for our Logetta grows from my appreciation, and indeed I dedicate this entire Logetta to all of you, and you'll notice a few times during the presentation I'm going to pause to weave their names in a little bit. Let's get started. I'd like to begin with this fresco, this mural. I'm not going to tell you where it is just yet. We'll end with it, and at that point you'll know so much more about it, it'll make quite a lot of sense. It's painted in the early 17th century by the Italian artist Bernardino Poccetti. What matters for us is its 3-part composition, beginning on the left, arcing over the door, and of course ending on the right. Let's get started on the left, where things are grim indeed. We notice perhaps a 2-year-old boy, blood running down his chest and cascading down the trompe-l'oeil stairs. He looks up into the eyes of his mother as he's passing away. She wails in distress as another mother above her does. We look around and we realize that we see the corpses of dead babies all over the place. Maybe this gives you an idea, if you know of, from the Gospel of Matthew, in the Nativity narrative, the massacre of the innocents. And there we see, with murderous insouciance, King Herod of Judea. Now, if we follow the massacre of the innocents up over the door, we see Mary and the baby Jesus receiving the slaughtered innocents into heaven. And we're going to continue around to the right, where we find not the massacre of the innocents, but instead it's called the story, or we could translate it the history of the Hospital of the Innocents. The Hospital of the Innocents. See what we have. The most arresting part of it for me is this group of mothers who are whisking their children out of the bedlam into the safety, into the orderliness of what seems to be called the Hospital of the Innocents. Up here, a couple of rows of boys are receiving probably some religious instruction. Here, they're learning to read, they're being fed here, so it's a place of orderliness. It's also a place of abundance and charity, as we see in the foreground a group of women tending to newborns, toddlers. This wet nurse is feeding this child. And if we follow it all the way over to our ending point, to contrast with the murderous scene on the left, we have a group of girls kneeling, perhaps performing some sort of recital for a group of dignitaries. We don't know at this point who the dignitaries are, but we recognize a masterful piece of propaganda that juxtaposes this hospital of the innocents with its sense of abundance and safety and orderliness with the chaos and brutality and tyranny of the scene on the left. Now, first thing I'm going to tell you about this fresco, and indeed the Hospital of the Innocents, is we have to answer some questions about it. So like, what is it? We have to ask, why does it deserve our attention in a talk about art history? And I wonder if at the end of the talk, you have any ideas about what it might say to us in our present moment. To begin with, it was founded in the early 15th century in Renaissance Florence. You may recognize the cityscape here. Let's just take a moment, the first time that I'd like to run readerboard style, a list, alphabetical order of several of my students who have gone into some form of healthcare, and we can just bask in the loveliness of it all. That's Stephanie Anderson, Abdullah Arjumand, Tara Brito, Caitlin Chontavong, Catherine Coe, Lisa Collins, Jess Dawson, Janelle Eliason, Katie Fisher-Price, Rose Tolly Friedman, Erica Gadzik, Renee Gibbs, Allie Grace, Gazlina Greywall, Jake Hemingway, Marcus Howell, and Corrine Ingram. This talk is for all of you and the others that we'll meet later in the talk. Our story is of Florence, but it begins with a non-Florentine. This is Francesco Dattini. He is the most well-known citizen of Prato, a town outside of Florence. He's the most well-known because he is among the wealthiest merchants to come out of Renaissance Europe. He also left us an overflowing cache of personal and commercial documents. We know a lot about Dattini. His connection to our story begins when he was 13 years old. That makes the year 1348. And that summer, making its way up the peninsula of Italy, was the Black Death. The epidemic ravaged Prato. It took from him his 2 parents and 2 of his 3 siblings, leaving him and his brother orphaned. Now, Dattini was taken in by a kindly townswoman. She took care of him for about 2 years, and for the rest of her life, continued a correspondence with him, and touchingly always signed them, "Your mother in love." Now, Dattini's experience as an orphan was, all things considered, fairly positive, and Florence is going to be one of the beneficiaries of this. Dattini is going to spend the next 60 years amassing his fortune, and part of that he will make involved in commerce in Florence. And that brings us to the end of his life, where once again he's going to re-enter our story. In 1410, significantly, died without any heirs. Now, he'd experienced firsthand the capriciousness of life and the value of charity. He left his entire fortune to charity, mostly to his home city of Prato, but to Florence's preeminent hospital, Santa Maria Nuova, he left 1,000 florins, and he charged them to build a new place, he said, to feed children who will be released with good diligence and caution into the commonwealth. Significantly, he insisted that this be a secular, a civic institution. It took several years before land was purchased, but if we orient ourselves here on Florence's cathedral, Duomo, and we walk about 4 blocks down this way, the Via dei Servi, we will come to one of Florence's most elegant piazzas, that of Santissima Annunziata, or the Most Holy Annunciation. It's striking for its lovely symmetry, the restrained classical Renaissance elements anchored by an equestrian monument. However, whereas today it's a venue for evening concerts, markets, protests such as last spring's climate strike, and even crime. The only time I've ever encountered anything illegal in Italy was when one of my students' suitcases was stolen in front of this excellent hotel as a transportation company was moving our bags to our coach on the outskirts of the city. What was the piazza like when land was purchased in Dattini's time? So this is a roughly contemporary drawing of it, and we recognize here on the church the bells, which we see here, but we notice that there are no flanking structures, no arcades. In fact, the land wasn't even paved. It was somewhat rolling with a little bit of nature, some gardens. It was a place that people gathered, where animals grazed. This is going to be the site of the newly commissioned Hospital of the Innocents, which is named from the biblical story. Now, they need to choose a designer. They chose Filippo Brunelleschi, who is well known. You may know of him for his engineering feat of successfully constructing the dome on top of Florence's cathedral. In these years, he started designing the Hospital of the Innocents. What's he going to give us? Well, surely he's going to look at contemporary hospitals at the time. The early Renaissance, there was a surge of hospital building consistent with a newly crystallizing focus on the Commonwealth, on the community. And roughly contemporary with the design he was developing is a hospital in nearby Lastra a Signa, and it was called the Hospital of Sant Antonio, which we see here on the left. It makes use of the relatively new convention in hospital design of bordering the street with a loggia as a transition from the street into the hospital. We see it on the left, and then we have an interior view of the vaulting of the loggia. This made sense for a hospital. Loggias had long been places where weary travelers, pilgrims could get in out of the weather for a little rest, and building them onto hospitals made a lot of sense. Perhaps somebody inside, some sort of patient, comes out and takes in the fresh air and watches the town. Maybe somebody brings some food. So a loggia in front of the hospital was pretty common. We also notice the arcades here on octagonal columns on a low wall. The vaulting is quite striking with lovely rhythm, very prominent ribbed groin vaults here with dark green and white alternating, and kind of a complementary red, a brick red, adorning the sense of the infill here. It's kind of a dynamic rhythm to this vaulting. Another contemporary work, a little bit earlier than Brunelleschi's commission, was built in Florence itself. This is the Hospital of San Matteo, currently incorporated into the Accademia, where you may have seen Michelangelo's David. Now, we notice some similarities with San Antonio. It's an arcaded loggia as a transition from the street. Similarly, the low wall, we can get inside the vaulting and notice again the octagonal columns. Here we have a little bit different vaulting here without the very prominent ribs, but it is a groin vault, which has, again, this repetition of linear elements. And we notice that the span of the vaults is quite a bit wider than the height of the columns. And lastly, the structure is anchored by a monumental pier over on our left. This is what Brunelleschi gave us. As you can see, He's following some of the conventions by giving us a loggia as a transition from the piazza into the hotel, into the hospital. What really strikes me first is his alternating rhythm of the white plaster with a local gray sandstone that was known as pietra serena, or serene stone. I have a gray string course here, another space of the white plaster, a gray horizontal architrave, another architrave arching along, describing the arches, and the pietra serena gray stone columns. What also strikes me about Brunelleschi's design is that he's placed the loggia up on a raised podium, which means you have to mount several stairs to get up into it. Now, what impression do we have when we look up into it as Brunelleschi wanted us to? Let's compare it to the two contemporary hospitals we saw, the Loggia of San Antonio, and let's bring in one of the columns of San Matteo. We notice that these two contemporary works have these octagonal columns on low walls. It creates a somewhat squat proportion in contrast to Brunelleschi's columns, which are of a much more slender proportion and reach all the way down to the ground. He makes use of the classical Corinthian columns capital. Overall, it's a sense of lightness compared to the other hospitals. Further on that lightness, let's look inside the vaulting. We have this rhythm in both of them. And in Brunelleschi's vaulting, there still is a sense of a rhythm, but it's more restrained because, okay, we have the gray transverse arches here, creating a little bit of a sense of rhythm. However, in all of the 9 vaults except the central one, there is white plaster and no groins, no ribs, instead half domes. Therefore, for me, I have a sense of, again, this lightness. I really think of a line of white bed sheets pinned to clothesline out in a yard, and a gust of wind comes up and takes them, and they billow up in sort of organic spheres. That's the sense of the lightness of this loggia with the slender columns. Let's look at the plan. This is a diagram of Brunelleschi's plan where we have drawn in his use of the height of the column is equal to the span between the columns, creating a geometric unity. The cube is central to his loggia. It's then the same distance across to the wall. And then it is the diameter of the arch here, creating, again, this sense of geometric clarity and, for me, elegance and restraint. Let's look at the plan that he devised. This is the original Brunelleschi plan. Over the centuries, the plan will be expanded quite a lot. He's given us here is the 7 vaults of the loggia, creating this horizontal elegance. And then perpendicular, we have here the living quarters. On the left side, we have the church. And then in the center, a couple of offices and this lovely square cloister or courtyard. So there's this sense of geometric restraint of the cube and the sphere, which will be central to Renaissance architecture. And Brunelleschi really is the bellwether here. And he uses this so often in his later designs, as do other Renaissance architects. Now, I feel like we're missing something because so far we have talked an awful lot about architectural ideals and geometric clarity. However, what about the kids? Isn't the Hospital of the Innocents supposed to be some institution for children? And indeed, in this photo from the early 60s, we see kids tearing around this loggia. The institution was in service to children for nearly 550 years, and you just know it was chock-a-block full of kids during all these centuries. What about them? Indeed, this is a recent picture taken in the courtyard, still a place of play and celebration for children. Now, we've admired its architecture, but we haven't really said what the institution was. I mean, is it a hospital? And the answer is it's not a hospital the way you and I might think of a hospital today. What was it? Let me take you to this photo that I took walking around Bridgewater, Massachusetts. At this fire station, you see the sign announcing that it is a baby safe haven, and for whatever reason, you can leave your newborn here, no questions asked. And that is the purpose of our Hospital of the Innocents. It's an orphanage for foundlings, and we get that sense with this dramatic photo here. I'd like to pause just for a moment and once more reflecting on the gravity of someone who feels compelled to give up their child anonymously, and the beauty of institutions that try to respond to that need. Thinking about that, let's run across a few more of my former students, such as Kim Ito, Haley Jones, Katie Jors, Jason Kim, Ashley Lau, Jessica Lee, Daniel Lim, Natalie Lovely, Kane McCaffey, Marissa McKelvey, Dan Mills, Sarah Moon, Hannah Nabilski, Devin Paxton, Hannah Phelps, and Aaron Pinto. Again, this talk is for all of you. Now, what do we know about how the Hospital of the Innocents worked? Let's go back to Brunelleschi's Loggia. At this end, to facilitate sort of anonymous drop-off for its really first 2 centuries, over next to this window on the right-hand side, there was what they referred to as a Pilla. In Pilla, we usually use as the word for a basin that holds holy water, and it appears there was some sort of basin here near the window that somebody could steal into the loggia, leave a newborn, and the cries would perhaps alert through the window. There was someone round the clock, a woman awaiting. She would dash out, they'd take the baby in, they would baptize it, clean it up. After the first 2 centuries, a little bit well known as an intake mechanism, they installed into the left side of the loggia what they called the wheel. It really was a lazy Susan type of operation. You could open a hatch, put a baby in, turn a crank that rang a bell, and somebody could retrieve the baby from the other side. Now, after 1845, until it officially closed down as the orphanage, the Hospital of the Innocents in 1994, I don't actually know, haven't been able to find out what the specific reception method was, but it did continue on for another 150 years. Now, what else do we know about the Hospital of the Innocents? And we know a ton because of its massive archive that still exists in here and is a resource for scholars. For each of the 375,000 children that were received into the Hospital of the Innocents, there is documentation. What do we find from the documentation? Well, one of the most interesting things is that many of them were given the last name of Innocenti, or innocents. Seems not to have been a stigma associated with that, because to this day, it's still a very common last name, at least not hard to find. So all I had to do was go on LinkedIn and I found a random Alessandro Innocenti, but I could have found hundreds others. Indeed, the great Italian soccer star of the 1980s, Duccio Innocenti, another example of this. Now, not all were given the name Innocenti. The first kid to be dropped off at the Hospital of the Innocents, we know the name she was given. It was Agata Smeralda. We see this is her page of documentation, and you may be able to make out in this cursive Agata Smeralda. Smeralda means emerald. I don't know why she was called Emerald, but I do know why she was called Agata, and that's because we read over here that she was dropped off. You may see di Sant'Agata. She was dropped off on the saint's day of Saint Agatha, thus she was given that name. What else do we find? We could read on, it's fascinating. She was dropped off on Friday, Venerdì, you may make out here, the 5th of February you see here, at the ore of 13. You might make out sort of the X in the 3 eyes at 1 p.m. And How anonymous was this? It turns out often the name of the woman who dropped child off was written down, such as this Giovanna Mona Giovanna di Recco. Now, Agata Smeralda is really a symbol, as the first of the orphans to be taken in here, a symbol for institutions that serve the needs of children in dire situations. Thus, the Italian nonprofit, the Agata Smeralda Project, which tries to facilitate adoptions from regions of the world in great distress, such as here in Syria. Now, what else do we find out pouring through the archive? One of the most affecting things I learned in this research was that sometimes a child was dropped off with what are called a sign. It's a little keepsake, a little item, such as maybe a medal, somehow a coin, or a little cross, maybe in this case, a little heart you can see. And really moving is that very often when they were left with an item like this, it was broken in half or close to that so that a family member could retain the other piece. And periodically, families came back to retrieve a baby, and it was easier to do so if, in a way, you could prove that that was your child. Now, how did it all work? Example, in the first decade, they received at the hospital about 100 foundlings per year. So let's say 2 per week. And for its first century, a little bit more than century, the model was receive the baby, baptize them in as quickly as possible, get them to a wet nurse in the surrounding villages, and eventually at 2, they came back, and then the hospital facilitated some sort of foster care, usually until about age 7. They came back, engaged in some sort of education, and ultimately they tried to find permanent adoption for them so that they could learn a skill, be included in a family, and become a productive member of the commune of the Republic. Now, eventually the numbers increased a lot, and finding adoption and foster care wasn't feasible anymore. And it transitioned essentially to a residential model, and the building expanded quite a lot. It's something of a labyrinth right now. In the 1850s, the numbers surged to 2,000 per year. It's like on average 5.5 per day. And eventually it began to decline until the last year that the hospital took in orphans, which was 1994, when it received 69. Now, over the centuries, the gender breakdown was usually about even. In the first several decades, there were a little bit more girls than boys. Perhaps people were dropping off girls because of the cultural expectation of providing a dowry, and maybe they felt unable to do so. But eventually it sort of evened out, and in the last year, there were more boys than girls, although not by a whole lot. Now, speaking of children, speaking of babies, the most beloved of the architectural elements of the Hospital of the Innocents is a series of reliefs, a series of roundels that was commissioned, we think, in 1487 by the De la Robbia family. De la Robbia family pioneered a new technique in glazed terracotta, and their really lovely relief sculptures are all over, still after 500 years, in bloom around Florence, and 10 of them were commissioned from Andrea de la Robbia, and they adorn the Brunelleschi's facade here in the spandrels between the arches. Let's look at some of them. So this one, wow, this guy's got a big personality. He seems to be welcoming us maybe to the hospital as he sort of presents it with his left hand, and he's nicely swaddled, and he just strikes me as so vibrant, so energetic, so alert. Take this guy out, have a little conversation with him. However, this little one here, quite a bit younger, a little reticent, bound up tightly, nice little chubby baby fat. Every single one of these has their own personality. My favorite is this one here, a little bit like the one to its right, alert, energetic, a little bit on the older side. But my favorite detail is what Andrea gave. Do you notice here? His left foot has come unswaddled, and it just is delightful to see these little naturalistic details. Next to him, even more unswaddled, is this guy who's got a lot hanging out with this great sense of exuberance as his swaddling is kind of flowing down in these serpentine lines. And gosh, over at the other end, this guy's given us the full Monty as he presents the hospital. Now, on each side of these, on each side, is a pair, 4 others in total, that were recreated in the 19th century. We're just looking here at the 10 original ones. Now, these roundels not only are just darling to look at, but they really exhibit what interests me about the Italian Renaissance here, the artist's attention to observation. Andrea had 12 children. He had a lot of models to study, the acknowledgement of individuality, the sense of inner life. I mean, we see this in the best Renaissance work. In each one of these kids, you get a sense for their personality. And also this idea that was crystallizing in the 15th century, that the commune, the Commonwealth, has an obligation to take care of its own. Now, speaking of that, if you were to go to the website of the American Academy of Pediatrics, you would see that the Hospital of the Innocents has influenced yet another contemporary institution, because their emblem is a little bit of an adaptation of our Della Robbia roundel here. This is a lovely opportunity for us to pause and consider our last group of my former students in a variety of healthcare roles: Kayla Reynolds, Savannah Roberts, Jewel Russell, Lydia Sargent, Cami Scheel, Jordan Schultz, Riley Saidi Kwan, JJ Strassnider, Michael Swan, Tiffany Toyohara, Megan Turner, Mary Wheatley, Cassie White, Kyle Wickham, Stephanie Wong, Sharon Zhang, and Leila Zamarodian. Now, one question we've never answered with the Della Robbia roundels is, what function did they serve? Now, I don't know if they need a function. They're just lovely. However, they were commissioned for a reason, and we can speculate a little bit about why. Now, in the 1480s, hospital was experiencing a crisis. They were receiving a surge of orphans, and they had a funding crisis. They needed money. Now, in 1487, they received a windfall, and that's the year that we think they commissioned these reliefs. Now, it's possible that in some sense they realized they needed to maintain something of a public relations campaign, so that the community understood in a very human way the work that they were doing inside, in hopes probably of receiving more bequests from people's wills, support from the Republic's government. Indeed, the simple fact is that funding always plagued the Hospital of the Innocents. And that leads us to some of its last adornments as we start to bring this to a close. So above the central entrance here, attached to the pediment, there is a bust of Duke Cosimo I de' Medici. And this is the early 17th century. And Duke Cosimo, this is long after the Republic was ended. It is now the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. And the inscription below Grand Duke Cosimo calls him in Latin, the father. Familial term is significant here, father of the family, benefactor of the Hospital of the Innocents. And it wasn't Duke Cosimo who commissioned this. Instead, it was the director of the hospital. And I think a little bit like with the roundels, the director wanted to associate the Grand Duke with the hospital and publicly identify him as its benefactor. To be clear, I think he's screaming out with this artwork that the Duke needs to adequately fund the institution. In fact, there are 2 other sculptures, busts, portrait busts of Cosimo's sons that adorn each side of the loggia. Even a little bit later, a fourth Grand Duke here, all wanting to establish the responsibility of the government to adequately fund the hospital. Now that brings us back to Poccetti's Fresco, The Massacre of the Innocents, contrasted with the story or history of the Hospital of the Innocents. Now, this is painted on the wall of one of the rooms inside the hospital, and it's therefore semi-public, and it's this work of propaganda that portrays Duke Cosimo II, 19 years old. He's just become the ruler of Florence, of Tuscany, as a duchy. And it's not he who's commissioned this work that identifies him as sort of the father of this wonderful charitable institution. It's not he that has identified himself with the Hospital of the Innocents. It is instead the director, Roberto Antinori, who himself was one of the orphans who was brought to the hospital and ended up being its director. He commissioned this work again to associate the Grand Duke with the hospital in hopes of more money. The truth is, they always wanted for money. That leads me to my last image, which is myself in 2015 with several of my AP Art History students. And as you can see, we're in the piazza, seated on the stairs, directly across from Brunelleschi's Hospital of the Innocents. And we're talking a little bit about what it houses today. It's a museum inside. It houses a regional institute that provides care and education for children. But for me, the most significant institution that it houses is what's called the UNICEF Office of Research Innocenti. And if you go to its website, you can see here that it conducts research, publishes, and tries to influence policy all over the world. Everything from, as you can see, how we use screens during the pandemic, all the way to trafficking and exploitation of children. Now, I was talking about this with my students, and one of them was very moved and asked me if I would take him in there so that he could make a donation to UNICEF, to this lovely institution. And so I said, sure. We walked in there, and we went up to the office, and I explained that he wanted to make a donation to them. And she thought that was generous, but she was sort of taken aback because that's not really what they do. She made a few phone calls and came back to me and said, listen, we don't take donations here. And so my student was left having to find some other route, like website. But what really struck me was his desire to reach out and offer assistance to this institution that assists the needy. And for me, in thinking about all of my past students who've gone into healthcare, that's what I see in them, their impulse to serve others. And that's the source of my inspiration for this Loggetta. I'd like to finish by acknowledging the source of my images. And I'd like to conclude by thanking you for joining us. I'd like you to reflect a little bit on what you got out of this, and a little bit like a loggia where we try to exchange ideas with each other. If you're able to, on the platform where you've watched this, could you leave us a comment? Could you suggest perhaps what the Hospital of the Innocents might say to us at our current moment? And lastly, I want to thank all of my students, and I'm sure that I must have missed some, and I feel awful about that. But to all of you, whether I named you or not, I so appreciate you for your service to others, no matter what form of healthcare you're in. Thank you to everybody. This talk has been dedicated to you. Take good care of yourselves and be safe.